During the Second World War, countless women were swept into the machinery of war, not as combatants, but as captives. Across the blood-soaked landscapes of Europe and the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, tens of thousands of women soldiers, partisans, nurses, civilians accused of aiding the enemy found themselves in German captivity. Their fate was often determined not by the laws of war, but by the prejudices, ideologies, and desires of their captors. Understanding how the Germans treated female prisoners of war requires examining a complex mixture of official policy, Nazi ideology, wartime necessity, and individual behavior that ranged from paternalistic condescension to horrific brutality. At the core of German policy was the Nazi racial worldview, which shaped how different groups of female captives were perceived and treated. Women from Western Europe, such as British nurses, French resistance members, or Dutch intelligence agents, were generally treated according to the Geneva Conventions, albeit with varying degrees of adherence. They were interrogated, often held in guarded compounds, and occasionally subjected to propaganda efforts aimed at demoralizing their countries. Although there were instances of abuse and harassment, these women, seen as racially acceptable, were more likely to survive and return home after the war. The situation was drastically different for women captured on the Eastern Front. Soviet female soldiers, partisans, and civilians were often stripped of any rights the Geneva Conventions were supposed to guarantee. Nazi propaganda had dehumanized Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans, and the Soviet Union had not signed the Geneva Convention of 1929 concerning prisoners of war facts the Germans used as justification for their treatment. Female Red Army soldiers, including the famous Night Witches pilots and frontline medics, were frequently subjected to humiliation, torture, and sexual violence. Many were executed on the spot, either as bandits or as ideological enemies. Others were sent to prisoner of war camps, where conditions were deliberately lethal. Starvation, exposure, and disease were rampant, and sexual abuse was widespread. Sexual violence, though officially forbidden in many contexts, was an ever-present threat. The German military command, aware of the potential for scandal and the breakdown of discipline, issued strict orders against rape. However, enforcement was inconsistent and often non-existent, especially on the Eastern Front. Wehrmacht soldiers, SS personnel, and members of the auxiliary police forces routinely exploited captive women. Some women were raped and then killed to conceal the crime. Others were forced into sexual servitude, either individually to their captors or collectively in so-called field brothels, established near the front lines. These brothels, often euphemistically referred to as recreation centers, included women abducted from occupied territories, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. One of the most disturbing aspects of German policy was the systematic exploitation of female captives within the concentration camp system. At camps like Ravensbrück, built specifically for women captives, endured slave labor, medical experiments, and psychological terror. Many were subjected to repeated sexual assault by guards or forced into prostitution for the benefit of German soldiers and camp officials. The SS established special brothels in camps such as Buchenwald and Mauthausen, and although most of the women forced to work there were political prisoners or Jews, some were female POWs from Eastern Europe. These women faced unimaginable degradation and had virtually no chance of survival once their usefulness had ended. Even outside the camps, female prisoners often found their bodies treated as part of the spoils of war. There are numerous testimonies from Soviet, Polish, and Yugoslav women describing how they were paraded, stripped, or photographed by their captors for humiliation and entertainment. German propaganda sometimes exploited captured women for psychological warfare. Soviet women, for instance, were occasionally shown in leaflets or newsreels as proof of the Red Army's supposed weakness, their gender used as a symbol of Bolshevik degeneracy. However, it is important to note that the treatment of female captives was not uniform. It varied depending on rank, ethnicity, the specific unit or commander in charge, and the situation on the ground. There are documented cases where German officers treated captured women with a degree of respect, even protecting them from abuse. Some female prisoners were exchanged through diplomatic channels, particularly if they were from neutral or Western nations. Others were assigned relatively safe tasks, such as nursing or clerical work in POW camps. These cases, though, were exceptions rather than the rule, and they rarely applied to women from the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, or Jewish backgrounds. The ideological lens through which Nazi Germany viewed women also played a significant role. Nazi gender ideology emphasized women's roles as mothers, caregivers, and bearers of racial purity. Captured women who fit this ideal, especially those of Aryan descent, were sometimes subjected to a different kind of exploitation: forced reproduction. In occupied territories, particularly in the East, German authorities implemented policies aimed at Germanizing racially suitable women. Some were coerced into relationships or marriages with German men. Others were forced to bear children in facilities designed to produce racially valuable offspring. These programs, while not as widespread as other atrocities, reveal how deeply Nazi ideology shaped the treatment of female captives. The psychological dimension of captivity also left lasting scars. Many women described the constant fear of assault, the degradation of being treated as property, and the trauma of witnessing the abuse or murder of fellow prisoners. Sexual violence was not only a physical act, but also a weapon of war, a means of breaking resistance, destroying dignity, and asserting domination. Survivors often carried these wounds for the rest of their lives, compounded by the silence and stigma that surrounded their experiences after the war. When the war ended, the suffering of female prisoners did not always receive the attention it deserved. Post-war trials, including the Nuremberg proceedings, focused primarily on crimes against humanity and genocide. While sexual violence and abuse were documented, they were rarely prosecuted with the same vigor as other war crimes. Many survivors, particularly from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, found their testimonies dismissed or disbelieved. In the Soviet Union, female soldiers who had been captured were often branded as traitors rather than honored as veterans. This added a cruel layer of betrayal to their already harrowing experiences. The legacy of how the Germans treated female prisoners of war continues to shape historical memory. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the intersection of gender, war, and ideology. Women were not merely bystanders or passive victims. Many fought, resisted, and endured unimaginable suffering with extraordinary resilience. Their stories, once buried in silence, have slowly emerged through memoirs, interviews, and historical research, offering a stark reminder of how war strips away the veneer of civilization and exposes the darkest impulses of humanity. The story of female prisoners under German captivity is not one of uniform cruelty or mercy, but rather a spectrum defined by ideology, circumstance, and individual choice. It is a story where humanity and inhumanity coexisted uneasily, where acts of compassion could occur alongside unspeakable brutality. And it is a story that must be told, not only to honor the victims, but to understand the full scope of the human cost of war. The treatment of female prisoners also reflected the evolution of the war itself. In the early years, when German forces swept across Europe with relative ease, the Wehrmacht maintained a semblance of order and discipline toward captives from Western nations. Women captured during the invasions of Poland, France, or the Low Countries were typically registered, interrogated, and placed in camps or prisons. However, as the war dragged on and the Eastern Front descended into a war of annihilation, the boundaries between military conduct and barbarism dissolved. The more desperate and brutal the conflict became, the more female prisoners suffered. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units tasked with exterminating Jews, partisans, and other undesirables were especially notorious for their treatment of captured women. They frequently executed women outright, regardless of whether they were armed combatants or not. Jewish women, in particular, were singled out for immediate murder, often after being sexually assaulted. Their treatment was a direct consequence of Nazi ideology, which saw them not as prisoners of war, but as biological threats that had to be eliminated. This genocidal mindset meant that the line between POW and civilian ceased to matter when ideology dictated extermination. Soviet partisan women captured behind enemy lines often faced some of the worst abuse. The Germans regarded partisans as illegal combatants, denying them any rights under the laws of war. Female partisans were routinely tortured for intelligence, subjected to public humiliation, or used as examples to terrorize local populations. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, and women were hanged or shot as warnings. Testimonies collected after the war speak of women being paraded naked through towns before execution or being forced to dig their own graves. These acts were not random. They were intended to break morale, discourage resistance, and assert total domination. The experiences of nurses and medical personnel captured by German forces reveal another layer of complexity. In many cases, captured nurses from Western armies were treated with a degree of respect, often assigned to continue their work in POW hospitals under German supervision. Yet Soviet and Eastern European medical staff were not afforded the same courtesy. Many were executed or enslaved, and those who survived often did so by enduring sexual violence or forced labor. Female doctors were sometimes targeted for interrogation due to their knowledge of military logistics, or treated with particular cruelty as symbols of Soviet gender equality, which the Nazis despised. One lesser-known aspect of the treatment of female prisoners was their exploitation in propaganda. German authorities occasionally used captured women for broadcasts or leaflets aimed at demoralizing enemy troops. These women, often coerced under threat of death, were made to deliver scripted messages urging surrender or denouncing their governments. In some cases, captured Soviet women were photographed and shown as examples of inferior Slavic womanhood, contrasted with idealized images of German women. This manipulation served a dual purpose: dehumanizing the enemy while reinforcing Nazi racial ideology. There were also instances where female prisoners were subjected to scientific experimentation. Nazi doctors, particularly those associated with the SS, viewed captive women as expendable test subjects. At Ravensbrück, for instance, Polish women, many of them captured partisans, were subjected to gruesome medical experiments involving bone grafts, infections, and chemical sterilization. These experiments were often conducted without anesthesia and resulted in death, permanent disability, or chronic pain. Female Soviet POWs were also victims of forced sterilization programs, part of a broader Nazi effort to eliminate populations deemed racially inferior. While official Wehrmacht regulations occasionally condemned such actions, the chaotic nature of the front and the ideological fervor of the SS meant that orders were frequently ignored or actively contradicted. Field officers often had wide discretion over the fate of prisoners, and their decisions could mean the difference between life and death. In some cases, women who resisted were executed on the spot. In others, compliance might earn them slightly better treatment, though better often still meant starvation, forced labor, and sexual violence. Not all acts of abuse were driven purely by ideology. The psychological toll of prolonged combat, the dehumanizing propaganda soldiers consumed, and the impunity with which they operated all contributed to a culture where violence against women became normalized. Many German soldiers viewed captured women as property spoils of war to be used and discarded. Letters and diaries recovered after the war reveal chillingly casual references to sexual violence. In some instances, soldiers described sharing prisoners among themselves or boasting about their conquests, revealing how far the moral compass had shifted. Yet even amid such darkness, there were moments of humanity. Some German officers and soldiers intervened to protect female captives, motivated by conscience, fear of punishment, or a desire to maintain discipline. There are documented cases where women were hidden from SS units, smuggled out of danger, or given false identities to escape execution. These stories are rare, but they underscore that not all Germans embraced the regime's policies with equal enthusiasm. For some, the atrocities committed against women were a bridge too far even in a war defined by atrocities. The collapse of the Third Reich in 1945 brought new dangers for surviving female prisoners. As German forces retreated and the front lines shifted, many camps were abandoned, and their inmates left to fend for themselves. Some women were murdered in the final days to prevent them from testifying. Others were marched westward in brutal death marches, where starvation, exposure, and execution claimed thousands of lives. Those who survived liberation faced an uncertain future. Many were emaciated, traumatized, and unable to return to their former lives. For Soviet women, liberation did not always mean freedom. Stalin's government regarded any soldier or civilian who had been captured as a potential collaborator. Upon returning to the USSR, many female POWs were subjected to interrogation by the NKVD, stripped of their military honors, and sent to labor camps. Some were ostracized by their families or denied state benefits. The suffering they endured under German captivity was compounded by suspicion and punishment at home, a cruel fate for women who had already endured unimaginable horrors. The memory of these women's experiences remained buried for decades. In the immediate post-war years, societies preferred narratives of heroism and victory over those of sexual violence and humiliation. Many survivors remained silent, fearing stigma or disbelief. It was only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries that historians began to systematically collect and analyze testimonies from female prisoners. These accounts paint a harrowing picture of systematic abuse, but they also reveal remarkable stories of resilience, solidarity, and resistance. Some women resisted their captors in small but significant ways, refusing to betray comrades, sabotaging work assignments, or secretly documenting atrocities. In several camps, women organized clandestine networks to share information, distribute extra food, or protect the most vulnerable among them. These acts of defiance, though often invisible in official records, were powerful expressions of agency in a situation designed to strip them of it. Today, memorials and museums across Europe honor the memory of female POWs and concentration camp inmates. Their stories serve as a reminder that the atrocities of the Second World War were not confined to the battlefield. The suffering of these women was part of a broader campaign of domination, exploitation, and extermination, a campaign that targeted not only armies, but entire populations. By examining how the Germans treated female prisoners, we confront not just the crimes of a regime, but the capacity of war itself to dehumanize and destroy. The story is not merely one of victimhood, it is also one of endurance. Many women who survived captivity went on to rebuild their lives, raise families, and contribute to post-war society. Their testimonies, often given decades later, are acts of defiance in their own right, refusals to allow their suffering to be forgotten. In telling their stories, we ensure that future generations understand the full cost of hatred and the depth of human cruelty. The question of how German society itself perceived and rationalized the treatment of female prisoners adds another layer to this dark chapter of history. Within Germany, propaganda played a crucial role in shaping public attitudes. The Nazi regime carefully crafted narratives that dehumanized the enemy and justified their mistreatment. Women from inferior races, such as Slavs or Jews, were portrayed as subhuman threats, unworthy of compassion. Soviet female soldiers were mocked in caricatures as masculine, degenerate, or sexually deviant, reinforcing the idea that they did not deserve the protections normally afforded to women. This propaganda provided ideological cover for atrocities, allowing perpetrators to see their actions as necessary or even righteous. German soldiers were indoctrinated from the beginning of their training to view the enemy as less than human. This dehumanization was particularly intense on the Eastern Front, where the war was framed as a racial and ideological struggle rather than a conventional conflict. In such an environment, the usual restraints of military conduct, respect for prisoners, protection of civilians, adherence to international law, were systematically eroded. Female captives, stripped of their humanity in the eyes of their captors, became targets of both violence and contempt. The dehumanization was not limited to ideology. It was institutionalized in the structure of the German war machine. The SS, the Gestapo, and the Wehrmacht each had their own procedures for handling prisoners, often conflicting and overlapping. Female prisoners could be interrogated by the Gestapo, exploited by the SS, and worked to death under Wehrmacht supervision, all within the same week. The bureaucratic nature of Nazi rule meant that atrocities were often carried out with chilling efficiency and paperwork. A woman might be transferred from a POW camp to a concentration camp under an administrative order, with her fate sealed by a typed document and a stamped signature. In occupied territories, the presence of female prisoners also intersected with broader German policies of population control and exploitation. Women were frequently used as forced laborers in agriculture, munitions factories, or construction projects. Conditions were brutal: long hours, minimal food, and constant abuse. Those who became pregnant, often as a result of rape, were subjected to forced abortions or had their newborns taken away. Some women were killed to conceal the evidence of sexual violence. In other cases, their children were taken by Nazi authorities and placed with German families if they were deemed racially valuable, a policy that left thousands of mothers permanently separated from their children. The phenomenon of war wives also emerged in some areas, particularly in the Soviet Union and the Balkans. Some German officers and soldiers formed coercive relationships with local women or female prisoners, offering them slightly better living conditions in exchange for sexual compliance. While these relationships were often portrayed in post-war testimonies as consensual, they were rooted in extreme power imbalances. For many women, the choice was between sexual exploitation and death. The Nazi regime tolerated such arrangements as long as they did not disrupt discipline or racial policy, and in some cases, they were even encouraged as a means of pacifying occupied populations. German attitudes toward Western female prisoners remained complex throughout the war. While they were generally treated better than their Eastern counterparts, they were not immune to exploitation. British and American nurses captured in North Africa or Western Europe were sometimes used as bargaining chips in prisoner exchanges or propaganda stunts. Their captivity was often used to demonstrate the supposed superiority and chivalry of the Wehrmacht. Yet even in these cases, there were numerous reports of harassment, assault, and psychological abuse. The notion that Western women were protected under German custody is a myth. While their chances of survival were higher, they were still at the mercy of their captors. The fate of Jewish women who were captured or deported was the most horrific of all. Once they entered the Nazi camp system, their chances of survival were minimal. Women arriving at extermination camps, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, were often separated from men immediately. Many were sent directly to the gas chambers. Those who were spared were subjected to forced labor, medical experiments, or sexual abuse. Some were selected for entertainment purposes by SS officers. The Nazi obsession with racial purity did not prevent sexual violence against Jewish women. In fact, it often intensified it, as rape was used as a tool of degradation and humiliation. One of the most chilling aspects of this system was its banality. Many perpetrators of violence against female prisoners were not sadistic monsters, but ordinary men, clerks, guards, soldiers, who committed atrocities as part of their daily duties. The bureaucratic distance between decision and action allowed many to rationalize their behavior. Orders were followed, reports filed, quotas met, all while human beings were being tortured, violated, and murdered. This banality of evil, as philosopher Hannah Arendt later described it, is perhaps most visible in the treatment of female prisoners, whose suffering was often seen as an inevitable byproduct of the war. Post-war justice for these crimes was uneven at best. The Nuremberg trials and other post-war tribunals documented some of the abuses against female prisoners, but sexual violence was rarely prosecuted directly. It was often subsumed under broader charges of war crimes or crimes against humanity. Many perpetrators escaped justice entirely, either because their crimes were not documented or because they reintegrated into post-war society. Some continued to hold positions of power in the new West German state, a fact that silenced many survivors and delayed public reckoning with these atrocities. It was not until the 1990s and early 2000s that historians and activists began pushing for a more complete understanding of the gendered dimensions of Nazi violence. Survivor testimonies that had been ignored or dismissed for decades were finally recognized as vital historical evidence. Feminist scholars highlighted how sexual violence was not a peripheral issue, but a central component of the Nazi war effort, a tool of terror, domination, and genocide. This shift in perspective helped reframe our understanding of the war and the experiences of those who lived through it. Even today, the stories of many female prisoners remain untold. Language barriers, shame, and the destruction of records have erased countless individual experiences from the historical record. Yet each testimony that survives offers a glimpse into the reality of captivity, the hunger, the fear, the small acts of resistance, the desperate attempts to retain one's humanity. These stories are crucial, not just for understanding the past, but for recognizing the enduring patterns of gender-based violence in war. The treatment of female prisoners under Nazi Germany is not an isolated tragedy. It is part of a larger historical continuum that stretches from ancient conflicts to the present day. The lessons of this history are sobering. They remind us that the laws of war, however noble in intent, are fragile when confronted with ideology and hatred. They show how easily the veneer of civilization can crumble under the pressures of total war. And they demonstrate that women, often seen as peripheral to the battlefield, are in fact at the very heart of its human cost. Their suffering and their resilience must never be forgotten. The story of female prisoners under German captivity is thus not just a chapter of World War II history. It is a mirror reflecting humanity's capacity for cruelty and compassion, degradation, and dignity. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and violence. And it demands that we remember, not as a matter of guilt, but as a matter of responsibility. For in remembering, we honor the women who endured the unendurable, and we reaffirm our commitment to a world where such atrocities are never repeated. The aftermath of the war brought a complicated legacy for the women who had suffered as prisoners. For many, liberation was not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of another struggle, the fight to reclaim their dignity, rebuild their lives, and make their voices heard in societies that often didn't want to listen. The silence surrounding their experiences was not just a personal choice, it was frequently imposed by governments, cultural norms, and even their own families. In many countries, the trauma of captivity was compounded by stigma. Women who had been sexually assaulted were often blamed for their own victimization, accused of dishonoring themselves or their nations. In conservative societies, even the suspicion of sexual contact with the enemy could ruin a woman's reputation. Some survivors concealed their experiences for decades, fearing social ostracism or rejection by their loved ones. The language of post-war remembrance focused on military victories, male heroism, and political reconstruction, left little space for the testimonies of women whose suffering did not fit the dominant narrative. This silence was especially pronounced in the Soviet Union. As mentioned earlier, returning prisoners of war, men and women alike, were often treated as traitors. Stalin's paranoia led to a policy of filtration, in which former captives were interrogated, surveilled, and frequently sent to labor camps. Female veterans who had been captured were stripped of their medals and denied recognition. Some were branded as collaborators or accused of having voluntarily fraternized with the enemy. This added a cruel irony to their suffering. After enduring unimaginable abuse at the hands of their captors, they were punished once again by their own state. The psychological scars left by captivity were profound and long-lasting. Survivors often suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming relationships. Many carried intense feelings of shame and guilt, even though they were victims of crimes beyond their control. The sexual violence they endured was not just a physical violation, but a deliberate attempt to destroy their sense of identity and self-worth. Healing from such trauma was a lifelong process, and for many, it was made harder by a society that refused to acknowledge their pain. Yet despite these obstacles, many women found ways to reclaim their stories and transform their suffering into strength. Some became outspoken witnesses, sharing their experiences in memoirs, interviews, and courtroom testimonies. Others channeled their trauma into activism, advocating for victims of wartime sexual violence or working to preserve the memory of those who didn't survive. Their courage helped break the silence and challenge the myths that had obscured their experiences for so long. In Germany itself, the reckoning with the crimes committed against female prisoners was slow and uneven. For decades after the war, West German society focused on rebuilding and integrating into the Western Alliance, while East Germany emphasized anti-fascist resistance and Soviet heroism. In both narratives, the suffering of female prisoners was largely overlooked. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s, with the rise of feminist scholarship and survivor movements, that a more nuanced understanding began to emerge. Researchers uncovered evidence of widespread sexual violence, forced prostitution, and gender-based atrocities, evidence that had long been buried in archives or dismissed as anecdotal. The acknowledgement of these crimes also forced a broader reevaluation of the nature of the Nazi regime. It became clear that sexual violence was not merely the result of individual misconduct or the breakdown of discipline. It was a structural feature of the Nazi system, woven into its policies of conquest, occupation, and genocide. The systematic abuse of female prisoners was not incidental. It was a deliberate tool of domination, terror, and social engineering. Recognizing this has profound implications not only for how we understand the past, but also for how we confront sexual violence in contemporary conflicts. Indeed, the legacy of Nazi crimes against female prisoners continues to resonate in the modern world. The Nuremberg trials set important precedents for prosecuting war crimes, but they largely ignored sexual violence. It would take more than half a century, until the 1990s, for international law to recognize rape as a war crime and a crime against humanity in its own right, as seen in the tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. The testimonies of women who suffered under Nazi captivity played a crucial role in this shift, helping to shape the legal and moral framework that now governs the treatment of prisoners in wartime. Their experiences also serve as a stark warning about how quickly norms can erode under the pressures of ideology and war. The Nazi regime was not the first, nor the last, to weaponize sexual violence, but its systematic and industrialized approach to dehumanization offers a chilling lesson in how such atrocities can become normalized. It shows that the protection of women in conflict is not just a matter of law, but of culture, education, and vigilance. It requires societies to confront uncomfortable truths, challenge harmful stereotypes, and hold perpetrators accountable, no matter how powerful they may be. The stories of individual women provide some of the most powerful insights into this history. Consider the case of Yelena M., a Soviet nurse captured near Smolensk in 1942. After refusing to reveal information about partisan activities, she was beaten, raped by multiple officers, and eventually executed. Her body was left on public display as a warning to others. Or take the story of Maria K., a Polish resistance fighter sent to Ravensbrück, where she endured medical experiments that left her permanently disabled. Despite her suffering, she testified at post-war trials and spent the rest of her life advocating for victims of Nazi atrocities. These stories, and countless others like them, remind us that behind the statistics are human beings whose lives were forever changed by war. Some women even found ways to resist from within captivity. They sabotaged production in factories, smuggled messages between camps, or maintained clandestine networks to protect pregnant prisoners. Others documented their experiences in secret diaries, preserving evidence that would later be used to expose Nazi crimes. These acts of defiance, often carried out under the threat of death, are a testament to the resilience and courage of the women who refuse to be broken. The memory of these women is now preserved in museums, memorials, and archives around the world. Ravensbrück, once a site of unimaginable suffering, is today a place of remembrance and education. Exhibits tell the stories of women from dozens of countries who were imprisoned, exploited, and murdered there. In Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and other former Soviet republics, monuments honor the female soldiers, partisans, and civilians who perished in captivity. These memorials are not just tributes to the dead. They are warnings to the living about the dangers of hatred, fanaticism, and indifference. Ultimately, the treatment of female prisoners by Nazi Germany reveals some of the darkest aspects of human behavior, but it also highlights the extraordinary capacity of individuals to endure and resist even the most extreme forms of oppression. It is a story that forces us to confront the realities of war beyond the battlefield, where ideology, power, and prejudice conspire to strip people of their humanity. And it is a story that compels us to ask difficult questions about how we remember, how we seek justice, and how we prevent such horrors from happening again. The legacy of these women is one of pain, but also of strength. They were more than victims. They were witnesses, fighters, and survivors. Their courage in the face of unimaginable cruelty continues to inspire those who struggle for justice and human rights today. By telling their stories, we honor their memory and reaffirm our commitment to a future in which the dignity and humanity of every person, regardless of gender or circumstance, are protected even in the darkest of times. The stories of women who suffered under German captivity are not only crucial to understanding the past, but also deeply relevant to the present. They reveal how fragile the protections of war can be, how easily international laws can be ignored, and how deeply ingrained prejudices can fuel violence on a massive scale. They show that sexual violence and the abuse of prisoners are not accidental byproducts of war. They are deliberate strategies used to break societies, assert power, and humiliate enemies. And they remind us that the victims of these crimes are not statistics or faceless masses, but individuals with names, families, dreams, and futures stolen from them. One of the most haunting aspects of this history is how long it remained buried. For decades, historians, governments, and even survivors themselves struggled to confront the reality of what had happened. The official records often reduced women's experiences to footnotes or euphemisms. Reports described harsh treatment or abuses without mentioning the sexual violence that was often at the core of those experiences. Survivors who tried to speak out were sometimes silenced or disbelieved, their stories dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda. This historical silence had real consequences. It allowed perpetrators to escape accountability, denied survivors the recognition they deserved, and perpetuated myths about the nature of war. Breaking that silence has been one of the most important achievements of post-war scholarship and activism. Through memoirs, oral histories, and survivor testimonies, we now have a much clearer picture of what female prisoners endured. These accounts reveal patterns of violence that were systematic and deliberate, not isolated acts of cruelty, but integral parts of Nazi policy. They also show how women navigated impossible choices, how some sought protection by cooperating with their captors, how others resisted despite the risks, and how many found strength and solidarity with their fellow prisoners. These stories complicate simplistic narratives of victimhood and heroism, showing the full spectrum of human responses to unimaginable suffering. The recognition of these crimes has also influenced how we understand and respond to sexual violence in modern conflicts. Today, international law explicitly defines rape and sexual slavery as war crimes and crimes against humanity. Courts in The Hague and elsewhere have prosecuted commanders and political leaders for ordering or tolerating such crimes. These legal advances owe much to the testimonies of women who survived Nazi captivity, women whose courage helped transform how the world views and confronts gender-based violence in war. Yet the struggle is far from over. Around the world, from the Balkans to Rwanda to Syria and Ukraine, sexual violence continues to be used as a weapon of war. Female prisoners still face abuse, humiliation, and exploitation in conflict zones. The lessons of the past remain urgent. Without vigilance, accountability, and a deep understanding of the mechanisms of violence, history can and does repeat itself. The stories of women under Nazi captivity are not relics of a bygone era. They are warnings that demand action. Education plays a vital role in that action. Teaching about the experiences of female prisoners during World War II challenges the myths that often surround war. It forces us to confront the gendered nature of violence, to recognize that war is not just fought with bullets and bombs, but also with bodies and identities. It encourages empathy, reminding us that behind every historical event are human beings whose lives were irreparably altered. And it fosters a commitment to justice, a determination that such atrocities will never again be met with silence or indifference. This is why museums, memorials, and educational programs dedicated to the stories of female prisoners are so important. They serve not only as places of remembrance, but as spaces for dialogue and reflection. They allow survivors' voices to speak across generations, reminding us of the consequences of hatred and the importance of human dignity. And they challenge us, as individuals, as societies, and as a global community, to uphold the principles that were so brutally violated during the war. The individual stories of women who endured captivity continue to resonate. There was Sofia, a Yugoslav partisan captured in 1943, who survived repeated assaults and forced labor in a camp near Vienna, only to dedicate her post-war life to documenting Nazi crimes. There was Elżbieta, a Polish courier for the resistance, who was forced into a camp brothel but secretly smuggled intelligence to Allied agents. There was Galina, a Soviet sniper who, after months of torture and starvation, escaped from a prison transport and rejoined the Red Army. Each story is a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, resist, and rebuild. These women did not choose to become symbols of suffering or resilience, but their experiences have become powerful reminders of both. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, individuals can cling to dignity, solidarity, and hope. They remind us that resistance is possible, even in the face of overwhelming power. And they remind us that memory itself is a form of justice, a way of ensuring that the crimes committed against them are neither forgotten nor repeated. The treatment of female prisoners by Nazi Germany stands as one of the most egregious violations of human rights in modern history. It was a campaign of violence that targeted not only the body, but the very essence of personhood. It was driven by ideology, fueled by hatred, and enabled by systems of power that devalued human life. And yet, amidst the brutality, there were moments of humanity, resilience, and defiance that continue to inspire us today. As we reflect on this history, we must do more than mourn the victims. We must honor their memory by learning from their experiences. That means challenging the prejudices and ideologies that lead to dehumanization. It means holding perpetrators accountable, no matter how much time has passed. And it means supporting survivors, listening to their stories, and ensuring that their voices are never silenced again. In the end, the story of how the Germans treated female prisoners during the Second World War is not just a tale of cruelty and suffering. It is also a story of survival, resistance, and the enduring human capacity for hope. It is a story that demands to be told, retold, and remembered, not as a chapter in a distant past, but as a warning and a call to action for the present and the future. For if there is one lesson that emerges from the testimony of these women, it is this: the dignity of the human being is fragile, but it is also indestructible. It can be assaulted, violated, and demeaned, but it cannot be erased. And as long as their stories are remembered, as long as we continue to speak their names and tell their truths, their dignity endures, a silent rebuke to the hatred that sought to destroy it, and a beacon of hope for a world that must strive never to repeat their suffering.